Hello, folks. Saturday evening, and we are going to be talking about the Halifax Bomber tonight. So welcome back to World War II TV. Sorry we ended up skipping the show this afternoon. We'll try and reschedule that at a later date. But we're going to be talking about bombers tonight. And my guest tonight, very big on Twitter. You all know her anyway, I'm sure, watching it. But those who don't know, Jane Gulliford Lowes, lawyer by trade, but also passionate about Bomber Command and Halifax bombers and bomb crews and air crews. And welcome to the show, Jane.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Good to be here. Yeah, I've sort of got a lifelong history and long love of the Halifax Bomber and Bomber Command in general.
And that's what we need, because we all know about the Lancaster and we don't know as much about the Halifax. I like the fact on Twitter today there was a conversation about the fact that there isn't an airfix model you can go and buy the Halifax, but of course you can go buy one on the Lancaster. Now that tells you something. It's like the Spitfire Hurricane thing. So the public know certain parts about the war, but they don't know everything. So we're going to address that tonight and talk about the Halifax Bomber. But I know you're going to be jumping in and talking about your family connection during the presentation. But just for those who don't know, you have got this sort of strong family connection with Bomber Command. So just basically explain that for us, for those who don't know.
Yes, my great uncle, Jack Clyde, was a wireless operator serving with 10 Squadron Bomber Command based out of RAF Melbourne in Yorkshire. And he completed a full tour between 1943 and 1944. Jack never spoke about his experiences at all after the war. He passed away in 1988. And when he died, I inherited his logbooks and all of his papers. I've even got his notebooks from wireless school. And I began researching his story and eventually wrote a book about him and his crew. And the Halifax obviously plays a massive part in that. And that's really when I fell in love with this aircraft.
Well, and that's a perfect time to bring us into the first slide of the presentation. By the way, folks, I have a cousin, William Bunting, who was shot down as a pilot of a Halifax bomber in 1943 in Germany. He'd been on Lancasters before, and then on his first tour, then he did second tour and got shot down in Halifax. So I've got a little bit of a family interest. But alas, in my case, all the logbooks and what have you are in the at Hendon. And so I could go and see them, but my cousin's sister ended up giving them to them. So I have never actually seen them or held them in my hand. So I don't have that connection there. Everything he had went off. So, but I have, just to mention, I've got a slight family connection as well. So we'll hand over to you, Jane, to explain about the history of the bomber, and then I will jump in with questions, as I often do, just to kind of put my point across. And of course, any questions you've got coming in, folks, we'll address them as well. But I'll hand over to you and then jump in when I feel necessary. So there we are, the Handley Page Halifax. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Everyone who talks about the Second World War and about Bomber Command only ever talks about Lancasters, and that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to explore the Handley Page Halifax, because it played such an enormous role in the Bomber Command strategic bombing campaign, but it never gets any of the credit. I call it the Cinderella aircraft because it just never gets talked about. I don't know why, but it sort of slipped out of our national consciousness, and everyone just focuses on the Lancaster, presumably because the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, Lancasters are still flying, and there's also the mythology which is built up around the Dams raids, Operation Chastise, and the Halifax has pretty much got sidelined. So I'm on a one-woman mission, if you like, to rehabilitate the Halifax. And I want to educate people about the historical importance of this aircraft and the massive contribution of the men who flew in her. I want to share the love, basically, for the Halifax.
And we want to be part of that love, Jane. That's
good to hear. That's good to hear. Okay, so I'm going to start you off with some basic statistics. I actually had a chap speak to me at a talk that I was giving, and he said, well, I've never heard of a Halifax. It can't have done that much during the war. So that sort of set me off on a journey of research, shall we say. It's okay, so we have got 6,178 Halifaxes built during the Second World War, so that's quite a tidy number. And there are probably only about 1,000 more Lancasters. 40% of all of the RAF's heavy bombers built during the war were Halifaxes. So generally they had a crew of 7, and they flew over 75,500 sorties. Now these are huge aircraft. They're absolutely enormous. We've got an average up weight, so up in the air, what the weight of the aircraft is around about 60,000 pounds, wingspan of 98 feet and 8 inches, and a bomb load of up to 13,000 pounds. Later Marks had a top speed of around about 282 miles an hour and a maximum ceiling of 24,000 feet and a maximum range of 2,350 miles, which put them right up there with the Lancaster anyway. Originally powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in the Mark I and Mark II models. Everyone always raves about the Merlin engines, but these were actually got rid of because they just weren't suitable for the Halifax, and eventually replaced with the Bristol Hercules in the Mark III and successive Marks. Now, people will be surprised to know that more Halifaxes actually took part in the 1,000 bomber raids than Lancasters. Not only did Halifaxes serve with Bomber Command, but they also served with Coastal Command. They served in the Mediterranean. They served in India. They flew SOE agents in and out of Europe. They towed gliders. They did everything. That's why I've called this talk the workhorse of Bomber Command. Basically, you name it, Handley Page Halifax did it. So if we can have a look at slide 2, we'll talk about the development of the Halifax. That title pretty much tells you all you need to know about the early Marks. It really was a dangerous aircraft to fly. So let's step back a little bit and talk about the origins of the aircraft. It really originates from 1936 and the reorganisation of the RAF into 3 commands: Fighter Command, Coastal Command and Bomber Command. The Air Ministry wanted 2 new heavy bombers. It was anticipated that whoever had the better strategic or long-range bomber would win the forthcoming war, which everybody was expecting. So various plans were submitted. The 2 designs which were accepted eventually evolved into the Short Stirling and the Handley Page Halifax. The Lancaster was a little bit further behind. So orders went in from the Air Ministry in January 1938, and the first prototype had its maiden test flight on the 25th of October 1939. And the first to be fully armed, flew for the first time on the 17th of August 1940. So we're talking about a period, very early on in the war. So to get these aircraft flying, the RAF basically reformed several squadrons. The first squadron that was reformed was 35 Squadron, specifically for the purpose of introducing the new bomber in November 1940, followed by 76 Squadron in the spring of 1941. So mass production techniques are imported from the USA, and gradually both squadrons are supplied with the brand new Halifax B Mark I Series 1. The aircraft that we have on the screen here. Now, it was actually built in bits and in sections, and the sections were then sort of transported around the country and then assembled together. Now, the original Mark I wasn't fabulous by any stretch of the imagination. It had a ceiling of only about 18,000 feet, a range of about 1,700 miles, and a crew of 6, because, as you can see, there's no upper gun turret there. It had 2 machine guns in the front turret and 4 in the rear. It had that double front look, a bit like the Lancaster, with the bomb in its position and the gun turret above. The Series 2 had gun positions either side of the fuselage, like the American beam gunners, but there was only 25 of those aircraft ever made. They quickly scrapped that idea. The Series 3 had new, more powerful Merlin 20 engines and an increased fuel capacity, and this eventually evolved into the B Mark II series, which became the standard operational Halifax. The Mark II had 4 Browning machine guns in the tail. It had an upper gun turret with another 4 and a single gun in the nose. However, great, we've got a brand new 4-engined heavy bomber, which is better than anything that the Germans have got, except for one thing: it's a death trap. The design was being constantly tinkered with, and as it got heavier and heavier, more equipment is added on, the aircraft became increasingly difficult to fly. The newly fitted upper gun turrets caused a lot of drag, and there was a new flame damping exhaust system introduced to try and sort of cover the engines up so that the flames weren't seen by approaching fighters. But all that did was cause more drag and made it more inefficient. And basically, the engines were just not powerful enough for what the aircraft was required to do. And there was also a massive problem with the tail design, which meant that the aircraft was likely to stall when trying to take evasive action. For, if the pilot suddenly has to go into a corkscrew to evade searchlights or fighters. So it soon began to develop a reputation for being a really dangerous aircraft to fly in. It was shoddily built and technically very unreliable. And there were heavy losses, not just in combat, but also in training accidents as well. So if we can move to slide 3.
So is it this one or that?
There was a continuous Sorry.
Are we on the right one?
Yeah, the one showing the crew positions. No, next one.
Next one. There we go. Yeah.
That one. Yeah. So there was a continuous program of adjustment and testing, resulting in the Halifax Mark II Series 1 Special. There are myriad different sort of designs and marks and different variations of this aircraft built throughout the war. Sometimes only a handful of particular models, but generally, this one was built in sort of greater numbers. So eventually, they removed the front turret altogether. You can see that that's gone, and it's replaced with a streamlined nose fairing. The later Mark IIs had this beautiful perspex nose cone, which I think is absolutely beautiful. I think it's a stunning looking aircraft. Some of the bulky mid-upper gun turrets were removed and made more streamlined, and lots of other adjustments were made to make it lighter and more efficient. The result was that this one was half a ton lighter than its predecessors. It was first flown on the 15th of August 1942 and sent out to squadrons in 4 Group that autumn. However, heavy losses continued. So I'll just quickly whiz you around a quick tour of this aircraft. So you can see tail gunner at the tail, obviously, mid-upper gunner on the dorsal area of the aircraft. You've got a flight engineer sitting behind the pilot. The pilot sits up high to the left of the aircraft, so he's not in the middle, he's actually up on the left-hand side. Underneath him took the wireless operator's seat. Then almost knee to knee with the wireless operator is the navigator, and sitting next to him is the bomb aimer, who then takes up his position when they're making their bombing run, lying on his stomach in the front of the aircraft, which is a very, very scary place to be. So it was back to the drawing board, really. So the Air Ministry decided to carry out tests on aircraft that had actually been flying operationally to try to establish where the problems lay. So instead of looking at sort of the prototype aircraft, they were looking at the ones which were actually flying, that the crews were taking up and, going backwards and forwards in and out of Germany night after night. And they identified several problems. Firstly, there was poor construction. These aircraft weren't well built. They were poorly maintained whilst on squadron. And they had a poor takeoff performance, which meant that the slightest mistake by the pilot could be fatal. They rarely reached their operational ceiling. They didn't get much beyond 15,000 feet, and for some reason, only up to about 13,000 feet if the weather was hot. So they were very much influenced by the weather as well. In cold weather, they were absolutely rubbish because they just froze up. And this made them an absolute sitting duck for the Luftwaffe and for the anti-aircraft fire, the flak guns, as they were approaching their targets. Pilots couldn't take sudden evasive action if a night fighter was spotted or if there were coned in searchlights. This was not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, so losses were beginning to spiral. Eventually, the Air Ministry arranged test flights to investigate the problem, and they found it was to do with the rudders. Now, to tell you how bad this aircraft was, the test crew were all killed on the first flight.
Oh, that's not good.
It's not good. That tells you all you need to know. However, important lessons were learned from this incident, because when the wreckage was examined, they realised that part of the rudder had actually sheared off, which meant that the aircraft was uncontrollable. And they eventually worked out that the problem was with the shape of the tail fins. They were triangular, and they were then redesigned into a square D shape like we have on this aircraft here. And that solved the problem immediately. It was no longer stalling when pilots were trying to take evasive action or to corkscrew or whatever, and it became a much more stable aircraft.
So if I can just jump in with a question, Jane, because I like to do that every now and then. In these early stages of the Halifax being a bit crap, at that point, was there any suggestion that they just kind of abandon design, abandon construction completely and switch to something else? Or was there always this, we're going to keep on going until we get it to work? Because a lot of aircraft in World War II don't start off very well and get better. I'm thinking the B-26 Marauder in the American Army Air Corps kind of started off as a death trap and got better and better. So was there any viable alternative at the point, or did they have to keep on going with this plan?
Well, this is something which I am going to address later on,
okay,
because this is something that Arthur Harris was very much involved in. And the answer is yes, basically they were stuck with it. But by the end of the war, we will see that this aircraft had evolved, and it's a constant process of evolution and refinement and developing technology. By the end of the war, this was a fantastic aircraft. So going back in time a little bit to where we are, we now have the B Mark II Series 1A, which starts to be dished out to squadrons in June 1943. And the later 1As also had some other notable differences: the new perspex nose cone and the low profile, more aerodynamic upper gun turret. So if we can have a look at the next slide. We're going to meet a crew. This is the crew that I'm going to be talking about as we go on through the evening. I think it's always better if we can sort of relate to actual people who flew the Halifax and who actually were there at the time, rather than just talking about statistics. Let's meet some of the actual people.
Perfect.
This is my great uncle's crew, Penny's Prangers, that's what they called themselves. This is the B Mark II Series 1A, which they are stood behind. Aircraft Z Zebra. This is 10 Squadron. This photograph was taken on around 10th or 11th of June 1943. And this crew had joined 10 Squadron just about 3 weeks previous to this. So at this point, they were very much a rookie crew. We're going to sort of to meet them as we go along in the talk. Now, they'd only met each other in the December, and they've been flying Whitleys in training before moving on to the heavy conversion unit to fly Halifaxes in March 1944. And bearing in mind that the vast majority of bomber command ops at this time were carried out under cover of darkness, this crew had only 16 hours practice time flying a Halifax at night, which is probably roughly equivalent to about 3 ops. However, they were quite lucky in that this crew was sent on a secondment to Coastal Command for about a month or so. Coastal Command at this point are desperately short of men and aircraft. It's, they're pulling in sort of spares and waifs and strays for wherever they can. And someone hatched a plan to loan out newly trained bomber crews for short periods of time before they were sent on to their operational squadrons. And this was useful in that it gave the crews more time to familiarise themselves with the workings of the Halifax, but it certainly wasn't all plain sailing. I mean, they'd be sort of heading out doing ops over the Bay of Biscay mainly, sort of looking out for submarines, that sort of thing, air sea rescue, sort of, spotting downed aircraft, that sort of thing. They experienced quite a few problems in this short time. For example, they had engine failures, numerous technical problems, but that's kind of the point. It helped them to learn to cope when things went wrong, as they inevitably did. So it's, it was very much a learning curve for them. So these guys join 10 Squadron on the 16th of May 1943, just around about the time that Operation Chastise is kicking off, of course. And they begin ops on the Mark II Series 1. So it's the older model that they've got, not the souped up version. And this aircraft here is the older one. Now, this aircraft was actually shot down the day after this photograph was taken, on the 12th of June 1943, following a raid on Bochum in Germany. They weren't flying it, obviously, but a different crew was, and they were all killed. So that was the end of Z Zebra. Now, what I would like to do now is to go on and and meet the crew. So if we can go on to the next slide. This is our pilot. This is Reg Pennicott. Reg is 26 years old. He's from Ascot in Surrey. He is a estate agent and surveyor by profession, very well to do, very well educated. Bit of a playboy lifestyle when he's not flying aircraft. He likes to go to Brooklands motor racing circuit and race motor cars on the weekend. So he's very sort of debonair, very, quite flash. But there's also another side to Reg, which his crew would learn about as they went on. And he was a very deeply religious man. And he was very much troubled through the course of the crew's tour about the fact that they were basically killing German civilians. He found that very, very difficult to cope with. And there was one incident recounted to me by Bill Bradshaw, the tail gunner, who I actually knew and got to meet. And that was before a Berlin raid in February 1944. He'd gone to give Penny the knock, say, come on, skipper, it's time to go. And he'd found Penny in his room on his knees praying. And he said, oh, you're praying for a safe return, skipper? He said, no, I'm praying for the German people. And that's quite something, isn't it? Anyhow, his crew absolutely adored him. And here we can see the pilot's position. So you can see he's sitting up there on the left. He's quite high up. Just next to him, there'll be a fold down seat where the flight engineer would sit on takeoff to basically help him hold back on the throttles on takeoff. And it's an extremely congested, claustrophobic environment on board a Halifax. They look absolutely enormous. You'd think they'd be quite roomy inside, but as we will see later on, that's just not the case at all. Very, very congested. Okay, we'll meet our next crew member. Tail gunner, this is Bill Bradshaw, the lovely Bill. Bill's from Northern Ireland, from just near Newcastle on Strangford Lough. And Bill started off life as a pilot. He went to Canada to complete his pilot training and he failed the course. So rather than repeat it, he was very keen to get into the thick of the action. And so he signed up to be a tail gunner. So he's one of the few pilot officers who were actually a tail gunner. Why did he do that? I asked him about that and he said, well, being 20 years old, he said, I was just a bit trigger happy, really. I was just trying to get into the thick of it, as you are, little knowing what actually lay in store for him. Now, obviously, the tail gunner's position is the most vulnerable on the aircraft. There was a very high fatality rate amongst tail gunners. You're very, very isolated from the rest of the crew. This is a bolt and pole turret. It's hydraulically operated, so it sort of twists around to allow the gunner to get in and out, but it's really, really cramped in there. And Bill will be sitting with his knees up under his chin for 5 to 6 hours or so, going out and coming back. It's absolutely freezing a lot of the time. Yes, they had some sort of heating in their suits and stuff, but quite often they failed. He recounted to me one particular incident where the icicles from his oxygen mask were so long they kept catching on his knees and knocking his oxygen mask off. So you imagine sort of doing that for 5 or 6 hours. It's not a great place to be at all. The turret is supplied with ammunition from a hydraulic belt system, which is fed into the turret from the rear of their aircraft. So it's all super streamlined. It's super efficient. It works really, really well. And Bill loved being a tail gunner. That was his vocation. He absolutely loved it. Not to say he wasn't terrified, because quite often he was a lot of the time, but it was very, very enthusiastic, shall we say. So much so that while they were on a mining operation over the Bay of Biscay, he decided that he would have a pop at the searchlights at La Police. Quite how he expected to hit the searchlights from about distance about 2 miles away with his 2 Brownings, I'm not quite sure, but that was Bill. He was very, very enthusiastic. Okay, and Bill also had another very, very important role on the aircraft. Skipper Penny had notoriously weak bladder. He was constantly having to pop to the LSAN, the little blue bucket thing, halfway through the aircraft. And when he did, he would call a Bill from the rear turret to come and fly the aircraft, because Bill had obviously been trained as a pilot. He would always say the same thing to Bill: no aerobatics, just fly in a straight line. which I think is great. Yeah. So Bill came in very, very useful. Okay, next crew member, please.
And it's come up in the sidebar already, and I'm sure you're going to address it later on. But I want at some point to explain how you got your roles within Bomber Command. You know, at what point in your selection were you pinpointed for a particular role? Was it based on aptitude? Was it based on whatever? I mean, I'm sure you'll cover it, but whenever you can, that'll be great, please.
Yeah, I'll address that now before I come to talk about Jack, actually. When you volunteered for Bomber Command, because remember, everyone in Bomber Command is a volunteer, you underwent various tests to make sure that you were suitable for aircrew. So, you know, there was, you know, basic sort of intelligence tests and what have you. And then you were selected on the basis of the results of these tests for particular roles.
Yeah.
So the brighter guys, perhaps those who've been to grammar school, or had degrees or whatever, they were selected for pilot, bomb aimer, and navigator. These are the most technical roles which require a lot of sort of mathematical aptitude.
Yeah.
The more sort of technical, hands-on guys were tended to be wireless ops. Jack had been he was a trainee, sorry, an apprentice joiner before joining Bomber Command. And then if you didn't sort of match up to any of those requirements, you basically got the short straw and you were trained as a gunner.
Gunner, yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically how it worked. So yeah, so this is wireless operator air gunner Jack Clyde, who was my great uncle. Jack joined the Air Force at the age of 18. And he spent a year training at air bases in Norfolk, RAF Raynham. He was there for a while, learning the skills to be a wireless operator. It took as long to train a wireless operator as it did a pilot. It was a very, very complex technical job. And this is his position on the aircraft, right underneath the pilot's seat. It's extremely claustrophobic in there. You can see he's only got one tiny little bit of window that he can see out of. Not that he'd be able to see much anyway, because it was usually night.
Yeah.
It's really, really congested and incredibly claustrophobic. Jack wasn't the tallest lad. He's probably only about 5'8", but even still, he would have been very, very hemmed in there. So if we can meet our next chap. So this is our bomb aimer, Ken Cox. He's got probably one of the most important jobs on board. I say that they were all equally important, really. Ken is a Londoner. He's quite a shy and anxious young man. He gets very upset about the bombing raids on London during the Blitz. Very worried about his family, and he gets quite sort of emotional about that. And he's quite anxious. Which, given the nature of his job, is not really ideal, because obviously he's seeing exactly what's going on the ground in Germany and thinking, oh God, is this happening, to my family back home, kind of thing. But he was very, very good at his job, extremely thorough. And this shows the position in the perspex nose of the Halifax. So on takeoff, Ken would be sat next to the navigator, and he would be assisting the navigator until it was time for him to take up his position, and just before they made the bombing run. And these two sort of padded things that you can see here are where he would lie on his stomach, rest his elbows on, and then look through his bomb sight at the front there, lining everything up. And he would then give the order as to when the bomb should be dropped, and he would press the button. He would then say, "Bomb's gone." But the aircraft then had to stay in position for about another 15 or 30 seconds while he took his photographs to prove that the bombs had been dropped before they could actually then wheel away and get out of there. So he really had the prime view of everything that was going on the ground. So we have our next. This is George, lovely George. George Phillipson is another Cockney. He's from the East End of London. He's the only one of the crew members, apart from Penny, who's actually married. And George is a lot older than the rest of the crew. George is 35. And the reason for that is that many flight engineers were older, more experienced men who'd worked for a lot of years in industry, so in the automotive industry, in heavy engineering. So these were guys who could basically fix anything, who could turn their hands to anything, and they keep the aircraft flying when things go wrong, as they inevitably do on board. So George is the busiest man on board, really, and he is standing up for almost the whole trip there and back. As you can see, his back is actually to the pilot, and he's facing all of his screens and dials and, you know, his fuel gauges, etc., that he's sort of fiddling on with as matters go on. But he's up and down the plane all the time, you know, checking things all the time. You can see how congested this is on board. So you've got the flight engineer stood there, then you've got your pilot up there on the left looking down towards the navigator, who is sitting there facing, and just underneath you can just see, I think, the arm of the wireless operator. So that's how congested this actually is on board. It's so claustrophobic, it's unbelievable. So we can have a look at our next people. Yeah, now we've got our two navigators. We had two navigators on the Pennycott crew. We had Roy Tan, first of all, in the middle. He's from Norfolk. This is exactly the same age as Jack. And on the left, we have Reg Cowles, who eventually replaced Roy in the crew. Reg is another Cockney and a very experienced guy. By the time he joins the Pennycott crew in November 1943, he has already got a DFC. You know, halfway through his first tour, and he joins the Pennycott crew because Roy is killed on an operation when he goes up with another crew who was short one night, and he's killed on the leg home. He crashes in Norfolk, actually just 20 miles from home. So there we have Reg, and finally we have our mid-upper gunner, Freddie Singh. Freddie is an Australian, as you might be able to tell from his darker blue uniform. He's from Queensland originally. He enlisted in 1941 and eventually came across to England to train, and he became a mid-upper gunner. Now, the engineer and the mid-upper gunner were the last people to join the crew, because they would only join the crew at the heavy conversion unit when the crew moved on to actually flying the Halifaxes, because the previous aircraft that they would be flying in training would just be five-man aircraft. The Freddie is a bit of a loner, but with a very sort of dry sense of humour. He's quite homesick at times. He's a very, very long way from home, because obviously when the other guys get to go and leave, which they did very regularly, about 6 weeks or so, they could all go home and visit their families. Freddie couldn't. So I always felt a bit sorry for Freddie, really. Okay, so if we can move on to our next photo, this again gives an idea of the very, very cramped conditions on board the aircraft. So starting from the top, you can see the pilot up on the left, if you're sort of facing the front of the aircraft. Behind him is stood the flight engineer, and right underneath in the little cubby hole that I was talking about before is the wireless operator. And just to the left there, that sort of brackety thing you can see, that's the fold down seat where the flight engineer would sit on takeoff and on landing. So yeah, it's really horribly claustrophobic. You can imagine sort of, you know, flying over the Royal Valley under heavy fire. It must have been utterly horrific, absolutely horrifying, basically. So anyway, that's the crew, and let's talk a little bit about the technology that we have on board. So all the Halifaxes had the D or GI parabolic navigation system, which has got a range of about 400 miles and is accurate to within a range of about 2 miles. But if you're trying to find your target in the dark, 2 miles are still a long way off. If you're trying to hit a particular factory, and this was a real problem for bomber commands in the early part of the war. The bombing was just completely inaccurate. You know, I think the Butt report in 1941 found that only a tiny fraction of the bombs that were actually dropped fell anywhere near. I'm talking like within 5 miles of their target. So you're sending out all these guys, you know, they're being shot down at a massive rate. And what are they actually achieving? Very little in the early days, because the technology just didn't exist to allow them to do their jobs properly. Now, in 1943, the Halifaxes began to be fitted with the H2S radar technology for ground mapping and target identification. And the radio that we saw in the radio operator's position, that's the standard R1155, which is fitted to most heavy bombers around about that time. But again, the technology is constantly evolving, but so is the German response. It's a constant game of cat and mouse, trying to keep ahead of the game. You'll just sort of suss, one bit of technology, and then the Germans will find out how to crack it. So then you've got to do something else, and then we'll be doing the same with theirs. It's constantly evolving and constantly developing the whole time.
And
now there are two important.
Just to interrupt for a second, but are the technological advances in parallel with the Lancaster as well? Is everything kind of moving at the same pace?
I would say so, yeah. Obviously, the Lancaster comes along slightly later than the Halifax, so its technology is already better when it starts.
More updated,
which is sort of early 42.
Sorry, and one of our viewers, Scott Grimman, said at some point, did Bomber Command identify that the Halifax was better suited to a particular type of raid to the Lancaster, and they kind of start giving them what their respective skill sets were, and if so, you can explain what those respective skill sets were.
Yeah, I'm actually going to come on to that later.
Cool. I've just preempted it as usual. I'm always doing that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there's two important members of the crew that I haven't mentioned so far that I would like to come on to next. We have the next slide. Yeah, that's a pigeon. A pigeon. The Halifax Mark I and the Mark II had 2 pigeons on board. Now, this is like really sort of high advanced technology. The pigeons were there to assist if the crew had to ditch the aircraft. They're homing pigeons. And the idea was that if the aircraft is about to ditch, bearing in mind it's likely to be in the dark, it could be on fire, it could be hurtling towards the sea at around about 250, 260 miles an hour, if not more. The crew are all trying to get out. The wireless operator is supposed to take a bearing, write that bearing on a piece of paper, put it in a little capsule in the pigeon's collar, and send the pigeons out so that they could then fly home to give Coastal Command an approximate location as to where the aircraft ditched. Now, that's a lot to do if your aircraft's on fire and you're plummeting towards almost certain death at, best part 300 miles an hour. Did it work? Who knows? I often wonder if this was just sort of psychological, oh, it's all right, we've got the pigeons kind of thing, we'll be all right. But the wireless operator, so Jack, would have looked after the pigeons. That was his job. He would collect them before every raid and take them on board. There are actually incidents of crews being rescued after pigeons got back. I think I've identified 2, which isn't very many, but better than none. But that's something that I want to examine further. I also wondered, well, how did the pigeons survive? Because obviously these aircraft aren't pressurized. How did they not just freeze to death or suffocate? But apparently they didn't. They were fine. So pigeons can fly a lot higher than we think they can. So wow. Those are the pigeons. So if we can move on to our next slide. So Penny's Primer's first operation was a raid on Wuppertal in the Ruhr Valley on the 29th of May 1943. So spring 43, the air battle of the Ruhr is just getting underway, and the plan is to attack German industry, which is concentrated in the Ruhr Valley. So you're looking at targets like Essen, where the famous Krupp's factory is, Wuppertal, Gelsenkirchen, all of those sorts of towns in this sort of big conglomeration of heavy industry, really. It's a very, very important centre for building aircraft, for building armaments, for tanks, for constructing railways. It's the absolute centre of the German war effort. I always resist the temptation to use the phrase Nazi war machine, and I deliberately didn't mention that in my book, but that's what it is, basically. It was labelled at the time the weapons smithy of the Third Reich. So it's very, very important at this particular time. Now, the crew take off on their first up to head towards Wuppertal, and their first operation is very nearly their last. They had a 20% chance at this time of surviving their first operation. Losses were so high. It's that bad at this particular time. And this is an entry from Jack's logbook, which describes the first raid. It's very, very brief. It says simply intense AA, that's anti-aircraft fire over target, compass US on return, landed at West Malling. 2 lines. That's all it said. Doesn't really sum up at all what happened, which I've actually been able to find out from the 10 Squadron operational diaries, and also from speaking to Bill Bradshaw, the tail gunner. Everything that could possibly go wrong for this crew went wrong on their first operation. So they are approaching the target. They're only 15 miles away from the target, just about to commence their bombing run, and they are hit by anti-aircraft fire. And that takes out the upper gun turret, smashes it, takes out the guns. Fortunately, Freddie, Australian mid-upper gunner, is okay. He's just got a few cuts and bruises, but that's rendered useless. So he then has to come down into the body of the aircraft and sit in the sort of what's called the rest area. But that also means is that you've got freezing cold air pouring into the aircraft. It's causing a lot of drag on the aircraft. But they are approaching their bombing run. They're only 15 miles away, which 15 miles isn't very much when you're traveling at 260 odd miles an hour. So they can't abandon the bombing run. They're right in the middle of the bomber stream. There's nowhere for them to go. So they keep going. They manage to drop their bombs. And just as they do so, Roy Tan, the navigator, reports to Penny, the pilot, that the compass has gone, the navigation equipment has gone. It's all the outer aerials have been hit by flak and everything's been rendered useless. All he's got is his astrolabe, which allows him to basically take a bearing on the basis of the stars.
Wow.
So this crew are in dire straits. As they are coming out of the target area, they are then hit again by a cannon shell, and this takes out one of their engines, which is on fire. So they then have to dive back down towards the hell that is breaking out on the ground below them. So all the anti-aircraft fire actually to try and snuff out this fire, which they do succeed in doing. So they are now left in a position where they've got no nav systems, they've got 3 engines, they're losing fuel rapidly, they've got a lot of drag caused by the fact that the upper gun turret has been taken out, and they're in a bad way, basically. Miraculously, Roy Tan, the navigator, is able to take a bearing and to work out where they are, in conjunction with Jack, who is able to take sort of various readings from radio, etc., to basically work out their approximate position, and they are able to plot a route for home. So Roy does that, but Penny knows that they are not going to make it to RAF Melbourne. There's no way that they're going to get all the way back to Yorkshire. So he asks Roy to plot a course to the nearest airbase, which to them is going to be RAF West Malling in Kent. So as they manage to get over the channel, they're flying quite low. Jack manages to get a message back to RAF Melbourne to tell them to warn Malling that they're coming, and eventually they limp home over the coast towards Malling. But their problems aren't over. As they are coming over the coast quite low, they're spotted by the Royal Navy, who think that they're a Heinkel or a Dornier and open fire on them. Now, very luckily, the Royal Navy actually miss, otherwise it would have been curtains for this crew, and the boys are able to land at West Malling. Now, can you imagine how terrified these guys are? They're 20, 21, 22. This is their first op. They know that they've got to do this another 29 times. Can you imagine? It's just unimaginable, really, as to how terrified they must have been. But they kept on going.
But my only feeling then, sorry, Jay, is that it can't get worse. I mean, that's the
it can't get worse.
Thing. Yeah, you know, we've had our worst flight ever. It can only get better now. We've got all of our bad luck out. You know, let's kind of go back and get back on the horse, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. They had a few very, very narrow escapes, including being coned in searchlights while doing a mine laying up of the Bay of Biscay right at the very end of their tour. They were coned by the searchlights, and usually when you get coned, that's it, game over. But they were lucky that they managed to get away. But yeah, there were lots of different things that happened which all contributed to the survival of this crew. For example, the Battle of Berlin. There was a raid in February 1944 that they were due to take part in, and they got as far as the Dutch coast, and they began to freeze up, and all the equipment started to fail, and they had to go back. Now, that particular operation, there was massive losses suffered by Bomber Command and also by 10 Squadron, and that all of these things just kept happening, just sort of chance occurrences, which all just contributed to their survival. And at the end of the day, that's what it was all about. It was about luck. You could be the best pilot in the world, you could be the most efficient wireless operator, the best bomb aimer, but ultimately it was all down to luck as to whether or not you survived. So they continue on with their operations. We're looking at further operations over the Roe Valley, but we're also looking at a Battle of Hamburg, July 1943. And Bomber Command are suffering absolutely massive losses at this time, and as are 10 Squadron generally. So of the 19 crews which joined 10 Squadron at the same time as Penny's Prangers in mid-May, 11 had been lost by mid-July. So that's 77 men and 11 aircraft. And those sorts of losses really just aren't sustainable. But this crew began to develop a reputation among the other crews, the other airmen coming in and out, as being the lucky crew. And the other airmen would actually touch them, pat them on the back before they went out on ops for good luck. And the crew absolutely hated that, because they felt that was, sort of, I don't know, that their luck was going to run out, basically.
Yeah, they're stealing some of their luck, borrowing some of their luck, and it's more pressure, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, it puts them under a lot of pressure. And they were on base, they were at RAF Melbourne for absolutely ages, just due to various different circumstances to do with, the strategic bombing campaign and, operations being stood down. They were on base for 10 months. Most crews completed their tour within 6, but the Pennycock crew were there for 10 months. And you can imagine their nerves must have been in absolute tatters by the end of that. Now, what I wanted to touch on was a point that someone mentioned earlier on about why did they persist with the Halifax? Why didn't they just, everybody moved to Lancasters? So Sir Arthur Harris, who took over command of Bomber Command in February of 1942, there he is, lovely Sir Arthur. I have a bit of a soft spot for Sir Arthur. I know he gets a bad press, but I do have a bit of a soft spot for Sir Arthur. But that's a whole other story. He absolutely hated the Halifax. The Lancaster was his darling, and he famously didn't get on with Sir Frederick Handley Page, and he called the Halifax a perpetual embarrassment, and he blamed it for a large proportion of Bomber Command's losses. And he actually lobbied to get it scrapped entirely. He was only ever interested in the Lancaster. However, much to his disgust, production continued throughout the war, and the Air Ministry told him in no uncertain terms, basically, to get on with it, make use of what we've got. We've got Lancasters in production, but we've also got Halifaxes in production. We can't just suddenly convert everything to creating to building Lancasters. But his views certainly made Handley Page pull their socks up in terms of development. So you now have a position in late 43, early 1944, where the losses of Halifaxes are so high that Arthur Harris orders the withdrawal of the Halifaxes from ops over Germany unless it's a maximum effort raid. And they were instead sort of redirected into other efforts, particularly mine laying and operations in preparation for the forthcoming invasion. So they'll still be bombing, but they'll be bombing transportation targets in France and marshalling yards, transport hubs, that sort of thing. Things continue to get worse for 10 Squadron. They have a particularly bad night where they lose 4 aircraft in one night in January 1944. Bearing in mind you've only generally got between 20 and 22 aircraft on squadron at any one particular time. 4 is a big loss. And by 20th of February 1944, 10 Squadron had lost 10 aircraft and 70 men in the space of just 1 month. Which is just utterly horrific. And that sort of scale of loss is replicated across other squadrons in 4 Group and in 6 Group, the Canadian group, which were also flying, and mainly Halifaxes at the same time. So after a disastrous raid on Leipzig on the 19th of February, in which Bomber Command lost 78 bombers, the Mark IIs, the Halifax Mark IIs, were withdrawn completely from ops over Germany. So 34 of the 255 Halifaxes which were sent out that night were lost, which is an attrition rate of just over 13%, which is massive. This decision quite possibly saved the lives of our crew, who by this time were about 2/3 of the way through their tour, because as I said, they're now put onto mine laying and they are put onto operations over France. But all is not lost for the Halifax, because we've got the Mark III being introduced. As I've said, there's this constant process of evolution and refinement of both production techniques and onboard technology. So now we have the lovely Mark III, and this is a game changer. I think this is one of the most beautiful aircraft of the Second World War. It's that perspex nose, it's just beautiful. I know I'm biased. So this is a completely different beast. So as early as late 1942, the plans for the Mark III are already well underway. And the first prototype actually flies in October 1942. And the first production Mark III came off the production line on the 29th of August 1943. And it is a game changer. Everybody raves about the famous Merlin engines, which powered so many other aircraft of the period. But in the Mark III Halifax, the Merlin inline engines are replaced by Bristol Hercules radial engines. So in an inline engine, it's exactly what you said. You've got your pistons lined up sort of behind the engine in a line. In the radial engine, they're around it, sort of like the rays of a sun, around your propellers like that. These engines are also now fitted slightly lower on the wing. And along with various other refinements, the result is a massively improved performance. So you've got an up weight of 65,000 pounds, so it's heavier than its predecessors. It's got a bomb load of 13,000 pounds. It's got the top speed of 282 miles an hour, but perhaps most importantly of all, it's now got a ceiling of 24,000 feet. So you are much higher up. You're much less in danger from anti-aircraft fire. And you've now got a maximum range of 2,350 miles, which means that you can fly deeper into enemy territory. Obviously, with any bomber, the greater distance you are flying, the more fuel that you have to take on board, so the lesser your bomb load. It's got to be, it's got to be balanced out. So the initial wingspan on this aircraft is the same as the earlier marks at 98 feet and 8 inches, but it's later increased to 102 feet 4 inches, so it's bigger still. In terms of size, it's not that much different to the Lancaster, really. And more Mark IIIs are produced than any other Mark. And it's eventually used in various different roles by 41 different squadrons, the majority in 4 group, the group to which 10 Squadron belonged, and also the Canadian squadrons of 6 group. 6 group and the Canadians were the first to take delivery of the Halifax 3 in November 43, before they were eventually rolled out across Bomber Command. And this marked the beginning of a long love affair between Canada and the Halifax, which continues today, as we'll hear later. So can we have our next slide? Shout out for the ground crews. Nobody ever talks about the ground crews, but these guys were absolutely essential to the running of the aircraft. And the air crews and the ground crews were very, very close-knit units. They socialized together, and as far as the ground crews were concerned, they were simply loaning the aircraft to the air crew for a particular operation that night. So a ground crew would probably look after 2 or 3 different aircraft, but they would look after the same 2 or 3. And lo and behold, if the aircraft came back shot to bits, as they invariably did, there would be hell on. The crew would be, chastised by the ground crew for bringing the aircraft back in a mess. Now, the little guy sat on the engine there is another great uncle of mine. He was actually on 10 Squadron at the same time as Jack, a different side of the family. That's Leo Groke, and he served with 10 Squadron throughout the war, and he was an armourer and artificer. Yep, I'm sure down at ground crew always get a mention. Ground crew men, and ground crew ladies. Let's not forget the ladies on board as well. There were a lot of women at RAF Melbourne who undertook various roles, just transporting the guys out to the aircraft, ready for ops, working in the parachute room, working in the map room. Again, they were absolutely essential to the functioning of a bomber command station. So the ground crews were very, very important, and when air crews were lost, which they inevitably were, the ground crews would feel that loss greatly, because, as I say, they had a very, very close working relationship with their air crews. So let's have our next slide. That's some photo, isn't it? That's the Pennycut crew, Penny's Prangers, with some of their ground crew. And that photograph was taken on the 8th of March, 1944, the morning after they returned from their last op, which was a raid on the marshalling yards at Le Mans in France. That's a Mark II, a later Mark II. They never got to fly the Mark III. 10 Squadron took delivery of their first Mark II just the day before that photograph was taken. So for these guys to complete a full tour in a Mark II in the second half of 1943 and early 1944 was nothing short of miraculous. So on the left there we have Freddie in his dark blue Australian uniform. Next to him we have wireless operator Jack, my great uncle Jack. Next to him we have Pennycut and the pilot. Then we have Reg Cowles, our replacement navigator. Then we have Ken Cox, our bomb aimer. George Phillipson, our flight engineer. Then we have 4 members of the ground crew: Norman Hunter, Ronnie Watkin, other Norman, and Alex. I haven't got his surname. Alec Hunter. And sitting next to them is Bill Bradshaw, our lovely tail gunner with the lovely smile. So these guys were incredibly, incredibly lucky. So in some ways, the failures and shortcomings of the Halifax, which led to the withdrawal of the Mark IIs from ops over Germany in early 1944, bizarrely probably saved the lives of this crew.
Yeah.
Now, Bill Bradshaw went on to be a gunnery instructor after completing his tour. Lots of the men went into to become instructors after that. And he actually got to fly the Mark IIIs in training. And he told me that compared to the Mark II, it was like a rocket. When doing fighter affiliation, the fighter escorts who were used to the slow and lumbering Mark IIs would complain that they could barely keep up with the new version. So you'll notice that Roy Tan is missing from that photograph. Obviously, Roy had been killed in the November 1943, and he'd been replaced by Reg Cowles. Now, by the end of the war, 3 of the 8 men who flew with Penny's prangers were dead. So 3 of these guys are gone. Another one is seriously injured and a POW. So that's quite sort of hard to take, but when you've got to know this crew, as I did when I was researching their story, it was absolutely heartrending, to be honest, because you feel like you get to know each of them personally. When you research and you get to know about their families, you get to know what they're doing, when they're not flying, you feel like you really do get to know them. Jack became an instructor as well, so he went up to RAF Kinloss, and he had a very quiet rest of World War II. Pennicott, again, he became an instructor as well, and also went to work at the transport squadrons. Reg Cowles decided that instructing wasn't for him. He missed the buzz of operational flying, and he signed up for a second tour. And he actually moved on to Lancasters. He moved to RAF Waterbeach, which I think is in Cambridgeshire, and Reg was killed on his 5th op of his second tour in December 1944.
And
so your chances of surviving a second tour were very, very slim indeed.
Did the number of missions you had to do to complete a tour change as the war went on?
Well, initially there weren't any set numbers, which was absolutely horrendous for the air crews. You just kept going until you were killed. But then it sort of, I think it was late 41, early 42, they sort of brought in a set tour, which was 30. Sometimes it was extended depending on operational requirements. For example, in mid-44, a lot of crews had an extra 6 added on because of the invasion, etc. You could volunteer to do extra as well. Some crews did, but I think most had had enough by the end of the 30. Certainly this crew had.
Yeah, understandably.
Yeah. Freddie had been ill over Christmas 1943, and he'd missed a lot of ops. He'd missed about 6 or 7. So he actually had to stay on while the rest of the crew went their separate ways. And he was still at Melbourne in May of 1944. And he was just going up as a spare bod with various different crews. It took him ages to rack up enough trips. Just before he was due to finish, he was shot down over Germany. And Freddie was lucky. He had an extremely miraculous escape, which I've described in detail in Above Us the Stars. But he was actually found lying in a field, bleeding very, very heavily. He's had a cannon shell through his thigh. And he was rescued by a German farmer, and who informed the local Luftwaffe, who got him to hospital very, very quickly, and his life was saved by German medics. Freddie was unusual in that he was one of the very, very few airmen who was actually swapped in a prisoner exchange towards the end of the war. So he actually got home before a lot of his compatriots because he was so badly injured, and he was on crutches for about 2 or 3 years. Believe it or not, that wasn't the end of Freddie's Air Force service, but that's a whole other story, which people can read about. So anyway, going back to the Halifax, production and development never stood still. While the Mark IIs and Mark IIIs were flying, there were Mark Vs as well, specials and Series 1A, which had completely different undercarriage systems, and they were actually flown by some of the Canadian squadrons during late 43 and 44. So the Halifax is also used by Coastal Command and for towing gliders. The French squadrons at RAF Elvington also briefly used the Mark V, and before they got their 3s in mid-44. For some reason, the 5s were before the 3. Don't know why that is. Mark Vs were withdrawn from ops over Germany round about the same time as the Mark IIs after the Leipzig raid. So by early 45, we're now onto the Mark VI, which is even better than the Mark III, and which actually outperforms the Lancaster. It's got a higher up weight, it's got a faster rate of climb than the Lancaster, and a slightly faster speed. It's got a new, more efficient fuel system. but it's only rolled out to squadrons in February and March 1945. So it's really difficult to assess the impact of this aircraft because the war's over in another couple of months.
Mm.
So having said that, even though the Mark VI was this super duper aircraft, by the end of the war, the Halifax was already marked to be phased out anyway in favour of the Lancaster. Sixth Group, the Canadians, Halifaxes were already being replaced with Lancasters by sort of late 44, early 45. And after the war, the vast majority of Halifaxes were simply scrapped. Though a few did take part in the Berlin airlift, or were used as cargo and transport aircraft. Some were bought by the Egyptian and Pakistan Air Forces, and then the Halifax pretty much disappeared from the national consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's all about the Lancaster. Every Halifax is forgotten about. So if we can move on to our final slide. There are no Halifaxes still flying. There are only 2 left in the world. One in the UK and one in Canada. The Canadian one is fully restored and it's at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada, and it is magnificent. The one in the UK is still as still in the condition is when it was found. Both were found at the bottom of Norwegian fjords and fished out at great expense. However, there is a fabulous reconstruction of Friday the 13th, which is at the Yorkshire Air Museum at the site of the old RAF Elvington, and that's the aircraft that you're looking at now. You can actually go inside it. And the photographs which I showed you earlier when we were talking about the individual crew members and their crew positions were actually taken by me inside that aircraft. It is a thing of beauty. It's absolutely exquisite. I love this aircraft. And it's absolutely bloody enormous. You just can't even begin to comprehend how big this thing is. And I often think about, this crew of 7 young lads, barely out of their teens, who flew this aircraft, and the thousands of others like them. Yeah. What incredible young men they were. At this point, I would like to shout out for the Yorkshire Air Museum because it's fantastic. If you haven't been, please go. It's absolutely brilliant. They've not just got World War II aircraft, they've got lots of other aircraft as well. They've got fantastic displays and a fantastic little naffy which serves lovely food. But I would also like a special word about their guide, Barry Fisher, who is so knowledgeable about Halifax and was so helpful to me when I was writing and researching above the stars. He basically allowed me to clamber around inside this Halifax to ask a million technical stupid questions, and yeah, just endless help, very generously given. People like Barry and all of the other people who work at the Air Museum are a real credit to it. Their knowledge is absolutely fantastic. Now, I mentioned before the Canadian love affair with the Halifax, and that very much continues. As anyone who goes to the Bomber Command Museum of Canada will see, 70% of the Royal Canadian Air Force crews of Bomber Command actually flew the Halifax. So as well as the restored one at the Bomber Command Museum in Canada, Carl Kjarsgaard, who's one of the directors then, who's responsible for the lifting and restoration, is working to raise and restore other Halifaxes. And I think there's actually plans to rebuild one from scratch, which would be amazing. Mm. So, yeah, as I said at the beginning, I'm on a one-woman mission to rehabilitate the Halifax here in Britain. I want to educate people about this wonderful aircraft and about the massive contribution that the Halifax and its crews made to the Bomber Command campaign. And I hope I've done that a little bit this evening. So that's the end of my talk, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Well, we've all enjoyed it, and the sidebar has been going crazy about engines and different types, and there's people like Pat who's knows about the subject, how he's been joining in. But my question is really about what, and you may not know the answer to this, has there been much analysis of the comparative success rates of Halifaxes versus Lancasters? Was one more accurate than the other? Is the bombing patterns better? We know that the Halifax had these early problems of the losses and what have you, but have they tried to compare in other ways across the two aircraft to make any kind of conclusions?
Endlessly.
Right.
Endlessly.
What are the conclusions?
Even during the war itself, they actually got Americans to come out and sort of fly both of them and see what they thought. The Halifax was always considered to be secondary to the to the Lancaster. What you have to remember is that the Lancaster's got different bombing technology. It's more powerful aircraft, and it's got a much bigger bomb load. It can carry heavier bombs, so it's got the blockbusters and the earthquakes and the tall boys. The Halifax can't take those. It can only take a much smaller bomb load. In terms of accuracy, well, none of them were very accurate to start off. I mean, let's face it, Bomber Command couldn't hit a barn door with a banjo, really. But obviously, as technology developed, that got better. And certainly by sort of early 44, mid 44, it's much more accurate. There's probably not much to between them. And certainly by the time that you've got the Mark VI, there's nothing between them. We've
had a couple of people say that the survival rates of crews bailing out were higher. Halifax was a safer aircraft in that sense. We also, there's a sidebar conversation going about the SOE agents dropped by Halifax, as you mentioned, the glider tank. So there's that role as well. And maybe you said that, they were good at they were pretty good at a lot of roles, whereas the Lancaster was perhaps very good at one thing.
I think that's an excellent way to put it.
We don't like, that's kind of like in football. It's like that player who gets a 6 at everything, never makes the headlines because he's a good all-rounder. And
Halifax is the utility player.
Yeah, the utility player. He's a good all-rounder, but it doesn't make the headlines. And the fact is, in some other shows we've done, the war isn't won by one thing or one aircraft or one tank or one nation. It's all the nations, all the tanks and all the aircraft. And without the role of the Halifax, we wouldn't have won the war any more than the role of the Beaufighter or the Lysander or whatever other aircraft we had doing whatever it was doing. But do you find it's a struggle when you say that you've got the interest in a Halifax? You must get fed up having to explain to people what the hell the Halifax is. Whereas if you were working on the Lancaster, everybody has that. Oh, Lancaster! I've seen that one fly over London last year in the sensor. Yeah. Is it a burden having to every time you kind of mention it, kind of introduce it to people?
No, it's not a burden, it's a pleasure, because I like to sort of, as I mentioned before, I like to share the love, and I like to sort of educate people as to what a great aircraft this was and how important the role was that it played. But yeah, so many people haven't heard of it. Your average bloke in the street will go, what's that? I've never heard of it. As I mentioned at the beginning, that chap I spoke to. So yeah, it's all about just sort of letting people know and telling them how important it was and what a massive role it did actually play. It might not have been the most glamorous, even though I think it's more beautiful than Halifax. I think it's more, and than the Lancaster. I think it's more aesthetically pleasing to look at because that beautiful perspex nose. But yeah, just give it a chance and get to know it. It was a fantastic aircraft and much loved by the men who flew it. As has been mentioned, it did have a better survival rate. I think you had something between, there's different figures. Somewhere I've seen 15%, elsewhere I've seen 24% chance of bailing out of a Halifax. Out of a Lancaster, it's only 11% because it's got a big central spar, which is very difficult to clamber over and get out of. The Halifax was probably also better if you had to make a crash landing because it was sectional. So if it did make a crash landing, it was designed to break into sections rather than just fall to bits. So it was quite a tough old unit. So I think that the crew survival rates were possibly higher in those circumstances.
Which could add to the crews having an affection for it because it's all about getting the job done of dropping bomb, but it's also nice if it can actually help you get back home and help you jump out safely.
Exactly.
And Michael Nelson asks, did they ever serve in the Pacific Theatre?
Not that I'm aware of. I think some were taken to India and tests on them were done out there, but I don't think that they were actually flown in any operations in the Pacific.
And I think that we talked about mine laying as well. We've mentioned the Halifax is under restoration and the preserved ones. I think we've done that. what's next for you in terms of you've done this, but are you your love affair with the Halifax clearly is not going to end soon? So
No, it's
you
not.
want to become known as the Miss Halifax, the woman
I
who
would
knows
love
about
to.
Halifax?
Yeah.
Is that the kind of the moniker you want to end up? That
Oh,
you're
I
the
always
woman
get accused of one of my friends described me as wanging on about the Halifax again. 'Cause I just love this aircraft, and I will talk about it for literally hours, as you can probably realise. I'm not quite sure. I'd like to do some more research on the Halifax in operational use, and in particular, I'm interested in sort of why. The reasons why it's been forgotten and why it's been overlooked, but I think a lot of that is to do with Sir Arthur Harris's view of it as well. It just got its reputation for being rubbish, and so that everyone pretty much forgot about it after the war. So I want to look at that, and I'm wanting to sort of explore the crew experience a little bit more. But my next writing project, I think, is going to be something completely different. I'm going to be looking at the D-Day Dodgers.
Oh, okay,
And the Italian
good.
campaign.
Wonderful. Well, we'll bring you back on to talk about that because we love doing shows about Italy. So, well, I think we've had a great show tonight. I've really enjoyed it. People watching it have learned something, so that's good. I will just mention to the folks what we've got coming up tonight, and I'll bring it back to you and say goodbye in a second. But so, folks, we've got a standalone show. It's not part of this sort of 2 weeks of female historians. But tomorrow night we've got Saving My Enemy, which is going to be an extraordinary show. There's about 5 or 6 guests because we're talking about the book written by Don Malarkey from Easy Company, the Band Brothers' daughter, Marianne, all about her father's friendship with a German veteran. They met many years after war, and they helped each other come to terms with the guilt they felt because of survival, the being goodies and baddies. And this amazing story of an American veteran and a German veteran becoming close. And they had been in kind of not in combat directly, but they'd both been in the Battle of the Bulge. They'd both been in the forests there, and they had kind of fought each other in the same theater. And so Marianne and her the German family, the author, they're all going to come on tomorrow and talk about that. So that's the same time tomorrow night, 7 p.m. UK time, Saving My Enemy. That'll be a great show. Then we're back on Monday with our historians again, and we've got the discussions of Samantha Cowan's coming on talking about remembrance. We've got the Olivia talking about Albert Goring. So lots of stuff coming up next week. But as for tonight, thank you very much, Jane, for joining in. As usual, folks, the links to Jane's book are in the description below. You can find out how to get it. Jane's account on Twitter, you can find her there and get in contact. And that's all there below. And if you've got any more questions, search her out on Twitter, and I'm sure she'll answer your geeky questions about Halifax. And if you've got information about Halifaxes, send it to her and she can add it to her database. And, we've got people there talking about their relatives who've served. So please make contact with Jane, and we can get that done.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear the stories. Yeah, really would.
We'll try and make some things happen. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. So as I say, enjoy your evening, enjoy your Saturday night. Thank you, Jane, for doing a great presentation. And I will see you all tomorrow for this amazing show about Saving My Enemy. So thanks for watching. I'll see you all tomorrow.